Hi everyone! Today we are talking about rinsing paper filters. There are a lot of steps in making coffee, but one of the first big debates is whether to rinse the paper filter or skip it. People are pretty split on this. Some always rinse, while others think it's not needed. And the choice you make can actually have a huge impact on your final cup of coffee. So today, I'm breaking it down from both sides. What happens when you rinse and what happens when you don't? Instead of saying, this is the right way, I want to help you understand both perspectives so you can find what works best for you. Let's start by talking about what happens when you don't rinse your paper filter. There are three main effects of not rinsing, and the first one is your coffee can end up tasting like paper. It's not difficult to imagine. If you don't rinse the filter, the coffee can absorb that papery taste, which lowers the final cup quality. Think of rinsing your filter as a kind of prep step in cooking. Even if you have high-quality fish or meat, if you don't prep it properly, it can have a strong gamey or fishy smell. It's the same with coffee. If you don't rinse your paper filter, you are not removing that papery smell, which can negatively affect the final taste. If you brew coffee without rinsing, the papery taste can interfere with your ability to taste the coffee properly. Now, some people say that certain paper filters don't smell as much because of the material they're made from. That might be true, but personally, I feel like most paper filters have papery taste, no matter the brand. Here's something interesting. You might have seen videos where people test the taste of paper filters by soaking them in water and then checking for any paper flavor or smell. But personally, I don't think this method is the best way to evaluate it. When you brew coffee using a paper filter, the coffee passes through the filter and gets cleaned in the process. You're not tasting the paper directly. You're tasting filtered coffee. But with this soaking method, it's actually more like cupping rather than a real pour over. If you've ever done cupping, you know that coffee tastes different when steeped compared to when it's filtered. In this test, the filter is completely submerged, meaning it extracts everything, including compounds that would normally be rinsed away before brewing. So even if a paper filter has a strong smell when soaked, if that smell disappears after rinsing, it's probably not a big deal when brewing coffee. That's why I feel like this test doesn't really give an accurate idea of how much a paper filter actually affects the taste of your coffee. Now, let's talk about the second effect that can happen if you don't rinse your paper filter. If you skip the rinse and use the filter as is, the heat of hot water will be absorbed by the dripper instead of fully reaching the coffee grounds. For example, even if you start brewing with 90 degrees Celsius, 194 degrees Fahrenheit, if the dripper is cold, it will absorb some of the heat. That means the actual water temperature hitting the coffee grounds could drop by several degrees, or even more. Why does this matter? A key factor here is that the surrounding temperature changes with the seasons. In the summer, your dripper might already be a bit warm, but in winter, it's often cold, meaning it will absorb even more heat from the water. As a result, your brewing temperature can become inconsistent, which affects extraction and overall coffee quality. So, if you don't rinse your paper filter, the dripper stays cold, steals heat from your water, and makes your brewing less stable. Alright, let's talk about the third one. If you don't rinse the paper filter, it stays dry, which means it will absorb some of the water when you start brewing. How does this affect coffee extraction? The first pour is super important because it helps set the balance between acidity and sweetness. But if the filter absorbs water, that first pour ends up being smaller than intended. For example, let's say you pour 50 grams of water for your first pour. If the filter absorbs 5 grams of water, that means the final brew yield will be 5 grams less. Even this small 5-gram difference can shift the balance between acidity and sweetness, changing the overall taste of your coffee. So, not rinsing your filter means your first pour is reduced, which can throw off the balance of acidity and sweetness in your final cup. So, how do you actually measure how much water the filter absorbs? First, place the dry paper filter on a scale and zero it out. Then, rinse the filter with water, shake off any excess, and place it back on the scale. When testing a Carita 155, it absorbed about 3.2 grams of water. For Hario 01 paper filter, after rinsing and weighing again, it also absorbed around 3.2 grams. Even a 3-gram difference can affect the balance between acidity and sweetness. And the bigger the filter, the more water it absorbs, meaning the impact on your coffee becomes even greater. So, these are the 3 main things that can happen if you don't rinse your paper filter. Firstly, paper taste in your coffee. If you don't rinse the filter, that papery smell and taste can transfer into your coffee. Secondly, dripper temperature drop. If the dripper isn't warmed up, it absorbs heat from the water when you start pouring, which can lower the brewing temperature until the dripper stabilizes. Thirdly, less water in the first pour. Since the paper absorbs some water, the actual amount of water reaching the coffee grounds is reduced, which can affect the final flavor. Now, let's talk about what happens when you do rinse your paper filter. First of all, it reduces the paper taste. Unlike when you skip rinsing, rinsing the filter helps remove most of that papery smell and taste. It might not eliminate it completely, but it cuts down on unwanted flavors, giving you a cleaner, more enjoyable cup of coffee. Secondly, it preheats the dripper. Rinsing warms up the dripper, helping to stabilize the brewing temperature. This is especially useful in extreme seasons like summer and winter, so you can keep your brews consistent all year round. Some people say Carita filters have a noticeable paper smell, but in my experience, if you rinse properly, it's barely noticeable. On the other hand, if you don't rinse enough, that smell can stick around, so taking the time to rinse thoroughly makes a difference. A little extra effort goes a long way. Proper rinsing helps you get a cleaner, better tasting cup. It's a small step, but definitely worth trying. Alright, let's go over some important things to keep in mind when rinsing your paper filter. Firstly, keep the filter's shape intact. If you don't set the filter properly before rinsing, it can shift out of place or tilt to one side. This is especially true for flat bottom filters with a wave design. If the shape gets distorted, the creases can become uneven, which can affect the consistency of your brew. How to rinse without messing up the shape. Gently press down on the top of the filter to hold it in place. And start by pouring hot water in the center of the filter. Then, slowly work your way outward to rinse the entire filter. This method helps keep the filter in its proper shape while effectively rinsing it. And why should you start pouring from the center? For drippers without ridges, like Carita, if you pour water on the edges first, the filter can shrink and collapse inwards where the water first touches. This can cause the filter to wrinkle, shift to one side, or become uneven, which can affect extraction. To avoid this, start pouring in the center to wet the base and stabilize the filter. Then, gradually move outward to rinse the sides. For drippers with built-in ridges, like origami, the filter is less likely to collapse, but it's still important to make sure the bottom stays flat and even when rinsing. Taking a little extra care with rinsing helps keep your setup consistent and improves your brew's stability. When rinsing a cone-shaped filter, the basic approach is pretty much the same as with a flat bottom filter. First, set the filter in place and gently press it down to keep it stable. I usually hold it in place with my thumb, then start by pouring hot water into the center of the bottom. From there, gradually move outward, rinsing the walls to make sure the entire filter is properly rinsed. At first, cone filters might seem easier to rinse than flat bottom filters, but if you pour directly onto the sides right away, the filter can stick to the dripper, causing one side to lift up. When that happens, an air gap can form between the filter and the dripper, which can mess with the flow of water during brewing and lead to uneven extraction. That's why it's important to always start in the center and rinse evenly across the whole filter. Second tip for rinsing your paper filter. This is something that personally really stands out to me when it comes to rinsing filters. A lot of times, I see people doing a super light rinse, just lightly wetting the surface. But here's the thing. The whole point of rinsing is to get rid of that papery smell. If you just splash a little water on it, you're not really doing much, and the paper taste can still end up in your coffee. If you don't rinse properly, the paper smell can still transfer to your coffee, and the dripper doesn't warm up enough, which can mess with your brewing temperature. How much water should we use? It depends on the type of filter, so it's worth testing how much it takes before the paper smell disappears. For me, I keep rinsing until I can't smell the paper anymore. If you've been using just a small amount of water to rinse, try using more next time and see how much of a difference it makes. Don't just wet it, rinse it properly. The third thing to watch out for is the smell inside the server. After rinsing your paper filter, your server is sitting underneath, catching all that rinse water. But here's the thing. If you dump out that water and take a sniff, you might still smell paper. Why? Because the rinse water, which picked up the paper smell, has been sitting in the server. So even though you rinse the filter, if you don't rinse out the server too, that paper smell can end up in your coffee anyway. Surprisingly, servers hold on to smells more than you'd expect. So after you pour out the rinse water, give the server a quick rinse with fresh hot water. It's a small step, but it makes sure there's no leftover paper smell, helping you get a cleaner, better tasting cup. How much water should we use for rinsing? Some cafes actually set a rule for this, like use X grams of water to rinse the filter, and honestly, I think that's a solid approach. For example, if 300 grams of hot water is enough to completely remove the paper smell and warm up the dripper, then it makes sense to train baristas to follow that standard. That said, 200 grams might be enough, or maybe 400 grams works better. It really depends. The key is to fully remove the paper smell and properly preheat the dripper. At the end of the day, that's what really matters. 3 key tips for rinsing paper filter. First, rinse the filter properly without messing up its shape. If the filter shifts or collapses, your extraction can become inconsistent, so be careful. Second, don't just wet the filter, actually rinse it. Lightly dampening it won't do much. To fully remove the paper taste, you need to rinse it thoroughly. Third, rinse out the paper smell from the server too. After rinsing, leftover paper smell can stay in the server, so give it a quick rinse with hot water. Focusing on these 3 things will help you brew more stable, better tasting coffee. Let's dive into why some people believe coffee tastes better without rinsing the paper filter. You don't often hear deep discussions on the no-rinse argument, so I wanted to share 3 key insights I found. First, skipping the rinse means you don't need rinsing technique. As we talked about earlier, rinsing a paper filter properly requires a certain technique. But if you don't rinse at all, you eliminate that variable entirely. For example, imagine you randomly place a dry paper filter into the dripper, add coffee grounds, and start brewing. Without any rinsing, gravity naturally pulls the filter into a balanced position as you pour water. Now, let's say the resulting coffee still has some paper taste, but the extraction is more even, leading to a better flavor balance overall. That could explain why some people feel like not rinsing actually tastes better. The second possible reason is that a cold dripper might actually help regulate the brewing temperature. If you're using really hot water, a cold dripper absorbs some of the heat, which could bring the temperature down to an ideal range. For example, if you're brewing with 98 degrees Celsius or 99 degrees Celsius, 208 to 210 degrees Fahrenheit, water, a cold dripper instantly pulls some of that heat away, dropping the water temperature to around 90 degrees Celsius, 194 degrees Fahrenheit. As a result, the extraction could end up happening at a more balanced temperature without any extra adjustments. Another possible reason is that the paper filter absorbing water could actually help balance the extraction. When you rinse the filter, it soaks up some water, so if your first pour is on the heavier side, some of that water gets absorbed by the filter, which might naturally adjust the flavor balance. The first pour plays a huge role in determining the balance between acidity and sweetness in coffee. In general, the more water you pour in the first pour, the higher the acidity tends to be. Why? Because acidic compounds in coffee dissolve more easily than sweet ones. If you pour a lot of water right away, more acidity is extracted, making the coffee taste noticeably high acidity. But if you don't rinse the filter, the dry paper absorbs some of that first pour, which means less water actually reaches the coffee grounds. As a result, the acidity might be slightly muted, leading to a more balanced tasting cup. Here are 3 possible reasons why skipping the rinse might actually taste better to some people. First, no rinsing means no technique needed, and the filter naturally settles into a good position. If you just drop the filter into the dripper, gravity helps it settle into a natural, balanced position. But on the downside, the paper taste is more likely to stick around. Second, a cold dripper might help regulate the temperature. If you're using really hot water, a cold dripper absorbs some of that heat, which can bring the temperature down to a more ideal range. This could lead to a more balanced extraction without extra adjustments. Third, the filter absorbs some water, which might help balance acidity. A large first pour usually extracts more acidity, making the coffee taste sharper. But if the filter absorbs some of that water, the acidity gets toned down, possibly creating a more balanced cup. These are 3 reasons I've thought about for why skipping the rinse might actually seem better. If any of this sounds familiar, try experimenting and see how it affects your brew. Does the water temperature for rinsing matter? My answer is yes. We should use hot water to rinse your paper filter. Why? Because hotter water dissolves compounds more easily and removes the paper smell more effectively. Think about it this way. If you rinse with cold water versus hot water, it not only affects how well the paper smell is removed, but also changes the temperature of your dripper. Another example is washing dishes. If you use cold water, soap doesn't lather as well, and grease is harder to remove. But with hot water, everything breaks down faster because heat increases energy and helps dissolve things more efficiently. The same applies to rinsing a paper filter. Hot water does a better job at getting rid of the paper smell. Plus, it warms up the dripper, making your extraction more stable. A tiny step, but a big difference. Not many people really take the time to look at both sides of the paper rinsing debate. But at the end of the day, everyone just wants to make good coffee. That's really what it comes down to. The only reason there's a divide between the rinse and the no rinse is because people have different approaches to achieving that goal. Nobody is out here trying to make bad coffee on purpose. That's why I think understanding both perspectives can open up new ways of thinking. If you are someone who believes a rinsing is essential, or if you are someone who thinks it's unnecessary, taking the time to see both sides can help you think more deeply about your approach. What I really want to share in this video is the importance of not just sticking to one way of thinking. Looking at things from multiple angles broadens your perspective and can even change the way you approach coffee. And in the end, I think that's what leads to making even better coffee. I guess a lot of people say coffee tastes better without rinsing, and that's totally fair. But I think some of the reasons I mentioned earlier might be playing a part. For example, maybe you realize, oh, I do use a lot of water in my first pour. If that's the case, why not try rinsing the filter and adjusting the pour size to see if it makes a difference? Small changes like this can lead to new flavors you've never experienced before. If this video helps you rethink your approach even a little, I'd be really happy. These days, there's so much information about coffee that even professional baristas can get lost in it. You've got people who are team rinse and team no rinse, and it can feel like there's no single right answer. But, like I mentioned earlier, if one of the points we talked about today applies to your brewing style, maybe it's worth rethinking your approach. For example, if you're using too much water in the first pour, or if your water is way too hot, those might be factors affecting your results. Personally, I feel that if you don't rinse the filter, it's not just about the paper taste. It can also affect the texture, mouthfeel, and even how the acidity comes through. That's why, in my opinion, rinsing the paper filter is the better choice. On my Instagram, I try to stay neutral, but here on YouTube, I want to go deeper and share more of my personal thoughts on coffee. I feel like the people watching my videos are serious about learning and really want to improve their coffee skills. So I want to give back by sharing my honest opinions and not just surface level takes. That said, I'm not here to push one opinion. I want to explore both sides of every topic. At the end of the day, we all love coffee, and that's what brings us together. That's what connects us, so understanding different perspectives is way more valuable. I see this as building a space where we can all dive deeper into coffee together, not as a place to pick sides. So, on YouTube, I'll be talking about things I don't usually cover on Instagram, going deeper, breaking things down, and sharing my perspective. Since YouTube lets me create longer, more in-depth content, I want to take full advantage of that and explore coffee on a whole new level. So I hope you'll stick around and keep enjoying Yuki's Coffee University. No brew, new brew. Let's keep exploring great coffee together. See you in the next one.